Hey, what's going on, guys? Dan Watson, and I shoot with the GH5. And so when this GH5s was announced, this is kind of important to me. This is a camera that I use all the time. It's my filmmaking camera of choice. I mean, I have a 5D Mark IV here, A7R3, Nikon D850. I'm actually comparing these cameras, which is why I have them, but I keep coming back to this GH5, even those amazing cameras. Two of these, well, they all technically shoot 4K, but they all have some limitations. And I just love this camera, but there's always been two weaknesses, and one has been the low light results, and then the other has been the autofocus performance, which in continuous is just not good at all, not good enough to use, which these two cameras have good enough autofocus to use. There are times it's really nice to have. I'm shooting this on the Panasonic G7 right now, so I have another camera back here, and this camera doesn't have useful autofocus either. So it's just something that we've learned to deal with. But now we have the GH5s, and at first this came out, and I was like, I felt like they missed it. I felt like it could have been so awesome. I wanted the improved GH5, and what we really have is more of an alternate GH5, and that's kind of the way I would put it, is that the GH5s is not the next sub-generation of GH5. It's just a different kind of camera with a different kind of sensor, and because of that, it has some abilities that the GH5 doesn't have and some abilities that the GH5 actually has. It doesn't have some abilities that the GH5 has. And so let's go through those and see kind of all of these aspects of this. Again, check out the description below. I got links to pre-order this thing. I appreciate your support by using those. If there's any updates to this, because this is all brand new, I'll be sure to update the description as well. So check that out. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Hit me up there, and I'll let you know my thoughts on this thing. But, you know, overall, this seems like a pretty cool camera. There are a lot of features that I can get really excited about. So let's kind of dive into those and see how this goes. Now, overall, I mean, honestly, I could take a red button right here, and I could just draw on this dial, and right here, you wouldn't notice the difference between this camera and the GH5s. And that's really not a bad thing. The ergonomics on this are unbelievable. Never had an issue with the GH5 ergonomics. And so, yeah, the cameras are almost identical when you put them up next to each other. As a mirrorless camera goes, this is probably the best mirrorless camera ergonomics I've ever seen, and it really is comparable with a DSLR. You just have the buttons exactly where they should be. You don't accidentally hit them, except for the display button, but you can now disable that. So Panasonic has been listening with stuff like that, so we have some firmware updates that have come along that have been able to make things better, but they haven't really improved, you know, things like autofocus and low light. So let's kind of dive in and see what Panasonic has been able to do with the GH5s that might help things here. I mean, the first thing that we're going to notice is a 10 megapixel sensor. Coming from a 20 on this, it's a really good thing because it's a little bit more catered for video, so now we don't have to figure out how to scale all of this resolution down to 10 megapixels. It means much larger pixels, it means faster readouts, so there's a lot of things that are going to happen as a result of that. And the most important is going to be the improved low light performance. With these larger pixels, we're getting a little bit more light absorbed by each pixel, and that's going to mean that we're dealing with some better ISO. Now, one thing that's new for this 10 megapixel sensor is that it's also multi-aspect, and I first saw this on the LX100, just a point and shoot camera that Panasonic has. They've done it on other cameras as well before. But this is something that allows you to get, basically it's going to get a little bit wider viewing angle on 4K and Cinema 4K than your 4/3, because it's actually a larger sensor than what we're used to in a Micro Four Thirds, and we are able to get the aspect ratio we want out of that. It's running on a circle instead of keeping the outskirts of the frame concealed on that normal 4x3. So it's really nice. It's giving us a little bit more area when we're shooting video, which is really good. I didn't get it as much on the LX100 because it's mostly a photo camera. People aren't using it for video, so I kind of didn't like it there, but it's really cool here. And then the other big feature is going to be this dual ISO. So technically, it's a 400 and a 2500 ISO. And what that's going to mean is it's going to switch circuits depending on what ISO you're shooting at in order to lower the amount of grain that you're seeing in that. Now, realistically, what I'm seeing on this is at 800s and downward, that's the ISO that's going to be using one circuit, and then over 800 is going to use the other. And what that means is that we're probably going to see some really good low light performance at around 800 ISO and getting up from there, similar to what the A7S is actually doing. And that's unbelievable. It's one of the big pet peeves that we had about the GH5. The biggest things for me on this camera that I haven't been happy with, the low light results, but we kind of knew that it was a smaller sensor, and it was better than GH4, so that was good. And the other thing is the autofocus performance. Now that one, I was actually a little bit more upset about that because we were actually promised really good improvements, and we didn't get it. Whereas the low light results, I think that we got what we expected, which is about a stop improvement from the GH4. So now that it's going to be vastly improved, that we're heading to about 800 ISO on that dual circuit and upwards from that. And what I've seen so far, it looks like it's going to be about 2.5 times more sensitive than the GH5 is now. That means that 12,800 is probably going to be very usable. I mean, right now with this, 800 is where I love it, up to 800. Beyond that, I can go up to 3200 ISO, and it's still pretty good. At 6400, I think it starts to fall apart. I try never to use it 6400 if possible. So if that means that I'm going from 3200 up to 12,800, that's not bad at all. I mean, we're getting into full frame camera territory just because of those larger pixels and then also that dual ISO. Another one of the big improvements is going to be 4K. I mean, we've always been shooting UHD 4K at up to 60 frames per second, but now that it's actually going to be cinema 4K, so the full 4,000 pixels on the width is going to be really nice to have if you shoot cinema 4K, DCI 4K, and that's going to be available with 10-bit up to 30 frames per second and 8-bit for up to 60. And then if you want to output to an external recorder, you can go 60 frames per second at 10-bit full 4K cinema 4K into an external recorder, and that will be allowed. So that is nice to see. Vlog is also included, which is, I guess, $100 savings if that's something you use, and if you're using this camera, you're probably going to want that. So that's good, especially with a 10-bit recording. You're going to want that for Vlog. Another big feature with that is you can actually apply LUTs now in playback. So you've always been able to see it on the screen. I personally don't use Vlog on this one, but you can always been able to see it on screen. But when you go to playback, it has never been possible. So now you can do that. You can also upload your own LUTs, although I'm told that the process is a little bit convoluted. However, it does come with Vlog to Rec 709. So if you're used to that, that's going to give you something on there. Now, the autofocus system, and again, this is one of the weaker points of a GH5 in general, unfortunately, it looks like it's going to be just about the same. Because of the larger pixels, it's able to see a little bit better in the dark, so we're going to get from -4 EV to -5 EV, but it's just contrast-based detection. The other thing that we might actually see is if you shot with this camera and really try the autofocus, you'd notice that if you're not using as much of the processor, like shooting in 1080p, for example, the autofocus does a little bit better. So it seems that maybe it's just so processor intensive that with all of the other things and IBIS and all that kind of stuff going on at the same time, it just really isn't able to keep up. So we might see a little bit faster from that point of view, just because the camera is reading out much faster, because now it's only dealing with 10 megapixels versus 20 and oversampling and all that kind of stuff. And we'll get into a little bit more into a second, but another big feature is that 1080p, we now have a max frame rate of 240 frames per second in the slow motion mode. And that means no autofocus or anything like that. Now, on the photo side, we actually have 14-bit RAW now, which is kind of cool if you're shooting like nightscapes, or the big thing, I guess, would be time-lapse. If you're shooting time-lapse, 14-bit RAW, it's still only 10 megapixel, but that's fine if you're going to a 4K video. Then it could be really nice for that one. Another big feature is that this port right here, rather being a flash sync port, can now have a PC sync, and also has an adapter to go to a BNC connector for time code out and in. So if you're using this in a studio setup with multiple cameras, that could be really nice. Another big feature I'd say is that the mic now offers phantom power and line input. So, I mean, generally when I'm shooting anything with high quality audio, I am not shooting into a soundboard and then into the camera. I'm using an external recorder. However, if you're at an event and you're shooting to an external recorder, you might be able to pull a line from that soundboard, a line out into your camera, and be able to have that. And then phantom power is always helpful, so if you needed that for a mic, now you don't have to use an external recorder. So that's actually pretty good to see. Something small is that we now have waveform and vector scope displays inside the camera. Again, I kind of feel that for that, I'd probably be using an external recorder, but we do have that. The viewfinder is also updated to 120 frames per second. That could be helpful in slow motion if you're using the viewfinder. I don't use it that much because the screen on this thing is just unbelievable. I have no issue seeing it in daylight. There should be less rolling shutter because of the faster readouts. And another thing too is, since we don't have these super large resolution sensors anymore, we don't need, we can have that anti-aliasing filter, which is nice to prevent moire and stuff like that on our video. We used to take them out for stills because we wanted super sharp results for still photos with these high resolution sensors. Now that's not a problem. It added it back in. So those are kind of the main features of a GH5s. And unfortunately, this kind of came with some bad things as well. there are a couple things that we cannot do. Now, keep in mind, these are two different cameras. The GH5 and the GH5s are completely different. So on this camera, for example, you can save your settings, all your custom features to an SD card. You cannot then take that and put it in a GH5s and expect to upload your settings. You will have to have that differently. So if you have a GH5 and you run a GH5s, you will need to set that up in customization. It's kind of to be expected a little bit, but something to note. Now, we do not have, the biggest thing on this is going to be, we do not have image stabilization. So, and I think this is because of the multi-aspect ratio sensor. It needs a larger sensor to be able to accommodate all the different aspect ratios on that. And that means that we no longer have a sensor that is moving. That's kind of a big deal because the in-body image stabilization was so good on this camera, and it worked in concert with most lenses on it to make things even better. So even if you had a lens like this one that has power OIS on this, it was still improved and still much better. That'll be probably the biggest loss for most people on this, is not having this feature. A lot of their lenses do have OIS on them. So, you know, for a lot of people, they're probably not shooting. I mean, I use gimbals a lot for that, so it's not a huge deal for most of the stuff I'm shooting, but you know, for family stuff, and that's probably the area that I use the OIS the most, it's going to be a big deal, and thankfully I have it in most lenses. So something else that this camera had that we don't get anymore is a crop mode. When we're super sampling or oversampling from this extremely large resolution sensor, that gave us some extra detail. That's one thing, is that we're no longer oversampling from this large sensor, but another thing that we could do is choose to, instead of oversample, we could crop in and use that extra detail to get us some extra push. It was a 1.3x crop, I believe, in 4K, and then like a 2x or 2.3x if you were in 1080p, and that was significant. I mean, when I was on a gimbal, I'd use this with a prime lens. I was able to get 2 focal lengths straight from the gimbal, and it's a really cool feature to have. The Sony a7R III also has that feature. You can program it to a button. It was so nice. That's actually going to be the feature that I would miss the most on this one. And then also keep in mind, without that high resolution, the new 6K anamorphic 6K feature that just recently came out with the upgrade, that will not be available anymore because we do not have that high resolution sensor enabling 6K. So I'd have to say I was more upset at first, and this is why, because this camera, to me, when I first saw it and first heard about it, this was going to be the new GH5, an upgraded GH5, fix the GH5 issues, and sure, it would mean that this is kind of an old body and maybe I have to upgrade and spend the money, but if it's something that I needed and I really would appreciate those new features, I'm happy to pay a couple $100s to upgrade to the new one. Again, it doesn't make this camera any worse, it just means that I have another option for that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, as a result of some of the things that they did, it means that the positives come with some negatives, and then the only thing that they've really fixed of the big issues is going to be the low light performance. So we'll see how good it is, but if it really is 2 to 2.5 stops, it's going to be significant if you need a camera that records 4K up to 60 frames per second. This is really your only bet right now. However, we're living in a day right now, we should see an A7S III probably coming up this year. That'll probably have 4K at 60, and a lot of people can live with 4K at 30. 1080p quality is very good. We're in 2018, but really the output of most videos only needs to be 1080p for a lot of stuff. And while I shoot 4K, if you had to drop it down for some slow motion to get that 60 frames per second, that's really not that big of a deal on most cameras. So, and you can get 6400 ISO and 12800 ISO on this one. So I don't know. There's a lot of things that I've loved about the GH5. I don't always like to shoot wide open on a full frame camera. A lot of times I want more depth of field. So I might have this camera at 1600 ISO f2.8. That's because that's the depth of field that I want. I would need to be at 5.6 on this camera to pull that off, and that would mean I would be twice as high on my ISO. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not always good to have a full frame sensor if you want that depth of field. These are nice to have. Also, you get unlimited recording and then dual card slots for recording 4K to both slots. It's just so much you can do with this 10-bit out, 60 frames per second. There are things in this camera that you just can't do with anything else in this kind of price point. That's going to stay the same. There's a lot of things to love about this. And so the more I think about it, the more I'm warming up to the idea. Losing image stabilization is going to be the biggest one for me, but if you stocked up on some lenses with image stabilization, use a gimbal when you have to. Most of us are using some kind of stabilization device anyway. I really wasn't doing a lot of handheld for my professional work. All of it was just kind of personal stuff anyway that I was using that for. I think I'm going to be okay. whether or not I can live with the other things, again, for me, the issue is going to be that crop mode. That was the one that I love the most. I loved using the most. I live with this on the gimbal, and I loved using it on the gimbal for that one. So anyway, that's it. You can check out the links below. I got information on this one. If anything new pops up, I'll be sure to update the description as well. Stay tuned. Check out the GH5 review, and some really cool stuff coming up with all these cameras, so make sure to subscribe. Hit that like button. I really appreciate it, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting me by checking out those links. I'll see you soon.